Think about this. The IRS just released its tax increases for 2024, while at the same time, President Biden just injected $124 billion, with a B, into the US economy through debt relief. The same nonsense happens in Canada. I'm in Toronto, and I received a check for $244 from the government called a Climate Action Incentive Payment, Canada's version of a stimulus check. While at the same time, the Trudeau government adds carbon taxes to gasoline. Those are opposite things.
So right now in Canada, this guy and this guy have set a price on pollution at this much per ton. That means that anytime you drive one of these, or these, you have to pay a carbon tax on the fuel that you burn while driving.
The double whammy in all this is that at the same time, the Bank of Canada and the US Federal Reserve just spent all of 2023 increasing interest rates to curb economic spending. Thus, these governments are putting money into your pocket at the same time as trying to curb inflationary spending. These are also opposite things. In addition to being contradictory policies, it's also just a waste of government resources to collect money from taxpayers just to give it back to the same people. Contradictions like this aren't limited to the government. As a follow-up to my first episode on woke contradictions, let's spend this episode reviewing 5 more. If you think these conversations are as fun as I do, hit those like and subscribe buttons. My name is Chris, and this is The Think Report. I think as we go through this episode, it's important to disclaim that although my criticisms are harsh, I in no way condone any sort of hate, bigotry, or unmerited discrimination towards any group of people. In addition, I'm also not claiming that the viewpoints that I criticize here are held by the majority of people who make up these groups. These are extreme viewpoints. Let's dig in. All right, so first up is one that's already making its rounds on social media. There are plenty of examples of intersectional groups jumping in to support Palestine, protesting that Palestine is oppressed and they need to be set free. The strange thing is that most of the intersectionalized, like gays, trans, intersex, racial groups, never side with the Jews, also a marginalized group. Why is that? Jews are a minority population that has been victim of anti-Semitism for thousands of years. Next to women and the black population, Jews are such an obviously marginalized population. Since World War II, and even before the recent Israel-Palestine conflict, Jews have been in a constant barrage of hate. Yet other intersectionalized groups never take their side. So instead of jumping in to support the traditionally marginalized Jewish groups, the LGBTQ community jumps in to the aid of Palestine and Hamas, a country, religion, and culture that condemns, assaults, and imprisons anyone who is openly LGBTQ. Palestine and Hamas are so vehemently against the LGBTQ population that they have official laws to imprison members of this group. So if it isn't obvious, there are 2 contradictions here. The first is that the LGBTQ community inflexibly subscribes to the support of all intersectionalist groups, except for Jews, which is hypocritical to accept all intersectionalized groups except for one, with no criteria or rationale why. The second contradiction is that the LGBTQ group specifically supports a nation that deliberately oppresses their own LGBTQ community. Those are opposite things.
If I tax people who work and I pay people who don't work, do I need to say the next sentence to you? You're going to get a lot of people not working.
That clip is from Hillsdale College in an interview with Arthur Laffer, an economist who is most famous for conceptualizing the Laffer curve, which is the theory for maximizing or predicting government tax revenues. I learned about him in university, and he's probably the person I'd be most excited to interview if I was to start doing that as part of this publication. What he is explaining in this clip is the concept of redistribution of wealth. In other words, taking money from people who have a little bit more by way of taxation and giving it to those who have a little bit less. There are two things that happen when government does this. The first is that by taking wealth from individuals who have a little bit more, you are reducing their motivation. Think about it. There is always a point at which every individual will make the decision that one more unit of their labor is no longer worth the income they receive in return. As a result, they stop working. So if you provide 1 unit of labor and receive 1 unit of wealth in return, you may decide that you're willing to work 2,000 hours a year. But if the government takes 40% of the wealth you earn, suddenly 1 unit of your labor only earns you 60% of a unit of wealth. Are you going to be equally motivated to work those 2,000 hours a year? Certainly not. So in essence, your taxes have reduced your incentive to produce. The second is that when you give wealth to someone without an exchange of labor or equivalent, you also reduce their motivation. Think about it. Like I said above, there is always a point at which every individual will make the decision that 1 more unit of their labor is no longer worth the income they receive in return. So if I'm to say to you that in addition to working 2,000 hours a year, I will give you 40% of your salary for doing nothing at all, which I've collected from wealthier individuals. Are you still as equally motivated to work 2,000 hours each year? Certainly not. Similar to the first point, if I'm willing to pay you for doing nothing, then I've increased your motivation to do nothing. So what does this have to do with Indigenous people, you say? Through the Indian Act in Canada and the Indian Affairs Program in the US, Indigenous people fit this situation perfectly. Some of the free wealth they receive include income supplements, food and housing supplements, free education, free dental, vision, and other healthcare. When I was in college, I had an Indigenous friend who was able to buy a car from the allowance from his reserve. I should clarify that many of these things aren't free in the sense that Indigenous people can walk into a university and demand free education. Funds are distributed to the reservation, which is then distributed to the Indigenous members. But the effect is the same. This is wealth which is distributed to them without an exchange of goods and services, which, as I illustrated earlier, would negatively impact their motivation to produce.
The media often portrays us as these sad, poverty-stricken people.
There isn't that focus on who we are today.
We live on the poorest county in America. It's poverty-stricken, but just because we live in poverty don't mean we're poor.
Do you feel American?
Nah, I've always been taught we were Indian. We were Lakota first.
So where's the contradiction here? It doesn't matter what the goal of the Indian Act is. If we pay Aboriginals to do nothing, then nothing is what they will do. Furthermore, it was Aristotle who said, "We are what we repeatedly do." For example, if one repeatedly steals, then one is a thief. If one repeatedly paints, then one is a painter. So what does this philosophy mean for our Aboriginal population? Well, if they're motivated to and repeatedly do nothing, then they are nothing. Is that our goal? Aiming for the prosperity of the Aboriginal people while compensating them to do nothing are opposite things. In recent years, there's been a noticeable change in political opinions, with younger generations leaning more towards social perspectives compared to their older counterparts leaning conservative. Currently, Gen Z shares many political viewpoints with the millennials, both showing a stronger liberal or social inclination than the preceding generations. According to a Pew Research study regarding the role of government, 70% of Gen Z believe the government should play a more active role in resolving national issues, opposed to the 29% who think that many of these tasks should be left to the individuals and businesses. This preference for governmental treatment is slightly more pronounced in Gen Z than millennials, and considerably more so when compared to the older generations. For instance, only 53% of Gen Z, 49% of baby boomers, and 39% of the silent generation express a preference for government action over private sector or individual initiative. According to a study from Apartment List, millennials have finally reached a significant milestone where more than 50% now own homes. For a generation whose identity has been shaped by an anxious relationship with the housing market, homeownership has been an audacious goal, growing exceedingly expensive and competitive compared to when their parents were coming of age. When we look at some of the charts from this study, we can see just how large the ownership difference is between each generation. Each generation has bought homes slower than the generation that preceded them. Millennials have had the slowest transition from renters to homeowners. By age 30, 42% of millennials owned their homes, compared to 48% of Gen Xers, 51% of baby boomers, and nearly 60% of silents. It took millennials almost 10 years to catch up. To lose a decade of asset appreciation from your home is not trivial by any means. When they ask millennials why they haven't bought a home, the overwhelming answer is that they can't afford to buy one. Here's the strange part. Gen Z and millennials believe the government should play a more active role in resolving national issues. In order to play a bigger role and solve more problems, the government needs more money. So they take more taxes. You see where I'm going here? More taxes means less in your pocket, which means our spending power goes down, impacting the affordability of a home. So what's the contradiction on this one? An individual's largest expense is almost always taxes, meaning that you'll spend more on taxes than anything else in your life. So the contradiction is that you can't have more economic affordability and more government at the same time. Those are opposite things. Many liberal and socialists argue that conservatives are heartless, greedy capitalists, and they only care about other people, when you could actually make an argument that the opposite is true. Conservatives want more money in their pocket so they can do a better job at putting a roof over their heads and feeding their children. In a study by SurveyMonkey on the partisanship influence of political donations, conservatives actually contribute more in charitable donations each year. It should be no surprise that Republicans and Democrats differ widely on gun regulations. In a Pew Research study, 85% of Democrats favor banning both assault-style weapons and high-capacity ammunition magazines that hold more than 10 rounds. Majorities of Republicans oppose these proposals, 57% and 54% respectively. Why do liberals and socialists want guns banned? Well, of course, it's because they threaten the safety of our communities. However, when it comes to punishing criminals who commit these violent crimes with the guns liberals are so worried about, the woke are the first ones to show leniency and compassion for these violent offenders. Now, as you could imagine, it's very difficult to find a study that broke down judicial leniency by political affiliation. So as a proxy, we're going to use the death penalty. In a Pew Research study that asked if Americans were opposed or in favor of the death penalty, Republicans skewed strongly for and Democrats against. The contradiction here is that the woke who support gun regulation due to safety threats are the first to show compassion for criminal sentences in spite of the same safety threat. Those are opposite things. Either you care about safety or you don't. Multiculturalism isn't new. It's been around forever. Just look at all the wars. The Aryan versus the Jewish in Nazi Germany, the Tutsi versus the Hutu in Rwanda, the white versus the black in South Africa, the far left atheist communists Khmer Rouge in Cambodia versus everyone else, and even ISIS only a few years ago. Between non-sovereign groups, multiculturalism is usually a dirty word and a source of conflict. However, to the woke, assimilation is actually the dirty word.
In January of 2021, President Biden proposed a bill that would change the word assimilation to integration as it pertains to immigrants. Now let me tell you why the wording is important. Assimilation means reflecting and taking on language, values, and beliefs of the dominant culture. it means that the person that moves here with time should not be distinguished from the one born here. Assimilation, the word assimilation, promotes exclusion of other groups and leaves too much for interpretation to an individual.
They encourage cultural diversity with different immigrant groups keeping their own culture and heritage. Some departments in Canada and the US have allowed Muslims to keep parts of their head covered for identification photographs. The US State Department, for example, gives explicit guidance for US passport photographs. It says, do not wear a hat or head covering that obscures the hair or hairline unless worn daily for a religious purpose. Your full face must be visible, and the head covering must not cast any shadows on your face. In this case, it is acceptable for the hair to be covered for religious reasons, as long as the full face is visible. Under no circumstances are face veils, niqab, allowed to be worn in US or Canadian passport photos. Everyone has the right to religion. I'm not complaining about that or anything really. I'm just pointing out that we've made accommodations in our laws that encourage multiculturalism. When surveying the US, there's almost a 50-50 split between those who believe that minorities should do more to fit in versus those who want to encourage cultural diversity. I couldn't find any data about how our various political parties feel about assimilation, but we can use a general sentiment about immigrants as a proxy. When we break this down by political party in Canada, the Liberals and the NDP are much more in favor of immigrants and by proxy, much more in favor of them keeping their culture for the sake of multiculturalism. The same is for the US, where Democrats are more in favor of immigrants, especially over the last 10 years. Getting back to the point at hand, I think it's clear that the woke view assimilation as a dirty word. However, here's the thing. Like I said earlier, multiculturalism has been around forever, with a wealth of examples that ended in war or genocide. In many of these cases, there was no biological difference, like skin, hair, or height, between the conflicting cultures. They were literally the same people. The only differences being religion or geography or culture. Surely there must be some examples of successful multiculturalism, right? In fact, there are, but they're not great. Multinational states are hard to govern. As examples, Canada struggles with the inclusion of the Québécois and the indigenous nationalities. India struggles with the Sikh independence movement. The US struggles with the incarceration of its black population. These examples pale in comparison to Israel and Palestine, or ISIS, or the Holocaust, but they illustrate that even the most progressive governments struggle with multiculturalism. The problem comes from groups pledging their allegiance to their faith or culture or country of birth over their new host country. In order for a country to work, a citizen's top loyalty must be to their new host country. I'm not saying this as a patriot. I'm saying this because it's the fundamental principle of our social contract, which is the concept that I won't steal from you and you won't steal from me. And if a problem does occur, the state will intervene and keep the peace. Together, we run the state. But if your loyalty isn't to the state, then we have dysfunction. Then the situation becomes about your values versus mine, and not the values of the state. You can see how this would breed conflict. So where's the contradiction here? The woke encouraged a multicultural state where all cultures are welcome and we all get along. Additionally, they sound the alarms when anyone says that we must assimilate our immigrants. We can't ask immigrants to place their primary sense of loyalty on their original culture and their new one at the same time. Here's the thing. Many of these examples are as humorous as they are worrisome. The real problem is that the political pendulum always swings back and forth. The progressives push forward, followed by the conservatives recentering us. Rinse and repeat. It swings back and forth. Here's the problem. I'm going to quote Sir Isaac Newton. For each action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. Right now, with school boards indoctrinating children into the LGBTQ community, intersectionality wars, and the proliferation of victimization, We're so far to the left that the inevitable swing back to the right will be equally absurd. Think about that.